As decentralized autonomous organizations, known as DAOs, become more common and tackle a broader range of challenges, they'll need identities the public can recognize. Brand identities. Will the creation of these brands also be decentralized? That's what one DAO is trying, and it just might become a more common approach to brand development. The story is coming right up on this episode of For Immediate Release. Another fine podcast from the FIR Podcast Network.
This is For Immediate Release, the podcast for communicators.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode number 232 of For Immediate Release. I'm Neville Hobson.
And I'm Shel Holtz. Today we are going to talk about DAOs, and in particular, how they're leading, perhaps, to a new approach to branding, decentralized branding. Now, if you don't know what a DAO is, stick around. We're going to tell you what it is and what decentralized branding has to do with it.
So DAO, that's DAO. It's an initialism. It stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization. Many of you will know this, will have heard of it, but most of you, I suspect, don't quite understand exactly what it is, because I certainly didn't until recently. And I'm not sure I still do, by the way, Shel. But there's a lot of explainers out there that you can find if you Google it, for instance, all defining this, that most of which is pretty jargony. So this entry in the Wikipedia listing is actually quite good. This is worth reading. It's long. So you're going to get just the intro to this to help try and separate this out from something that isn't a DAO, which is typically the typical organization. So Wikipedia says a DAO is an organization represented by rules encoded as a computer program that is transparent, controlled by the organization members, and not influenced by a central government. In other words, they are member-owned communities without centralized leadership. A DAO's financial transaction record and program rules are maintained on a blockchain. Interesting caveat right up front, the precise legal status of this type of business organization is unclear. And indeed, the article goes later into this about, I think there's only a handful, maybe less than a handful of states in the US that actually have the ability to create a DAO as a legal entity. And so this is still emerging. That's the point to note. It's not like it's a weird thing. It's still in process. The final bit to mention is a bit about the blockchain. Decentralized autonomous organizations, says Wikipedia, are typified by the use of blockchain technology to provide a secure digital ledger to track digital interactions across the internet, hardened against forgery by trusted timestamping and dissemination of a distributed database. This approach eliminates the need to involve a mutually acceptable, trusted third party in any decentralized digital interaction of cryptocurrency transactions, such as a bank. So it's all about a change in how businesses are established and become legal entities, which are centralized. So this is the opposite of that. That's community focused. Now, this may not suffice as a complete explainer, and I encourage you to go and read the Wikipedia article. It is important to understand what a DAO is. That would help you understand what we're going to talk about on this rather interesting topic about branding.
When it comes to Web3, DAOs are what really excite me the most. I mean, there's a lot of dimensions to this. It's all still congealing. But the prospect for DAOs excite me more than even the metaverse, even NFTs. DAOs just, my imagination goes wild. The technical explanation is great, but I think if you look at a couple of examples of DAOs, it really starts to take shape. And most of them that are out there, and there are new ones forming all the time. There are literally thousands of them now. But most of them are pooling resources for crypto investment. And I'm not really grasping the ideas there. Of course, you and I talked about one, Neville, that pooled resources to buy a copy of Dune, the book, thinking that it gave them the copyright to the book. And they ended up spending, millions of dollars on a copy of a book that was just a copy of a book that, you or I could have told them that. But there are some that are very exciting. The one that I am most intrigued by is called VitaDAO. And what they're trying to do is accelerate research into human longevity, find ways to make people live longer, healthier, more robust lives. They don't think the pharmaceutical industry is going about this in the right way. It takes too long, and they're focusing on research that's going to result in profit for them. So their goal is to pool a bunch of money in their treasury and solicit proposals from researchers, which then on the Discord group, they have a team that evaluates it, makes a recommendation to the rest of the group, which then votes on which of these proposals they're going to support. And they have distributed $4 million in research grants aimed at human longevity. When you buy into a DAO, when you become a member of a DAO, you transfer money in exchange for tokens, which is what blockchains do. They produce tokens. And your token is your voting right. Obviously, the more tokens you have, the more votes you have. But it is the community and their votes based on their tokens that is the source of all decision-making in a DAO. So I find VitaDAO to be fascinating. It's an end run around the pharmaceutical industry's approach to this. And they refer to it as democratizing human longevity. And that's a bit of a brand, isn't it? Which brings us to the branding discussion, which I read in a post from some of the people behind a DAO called Cabin DAO. Now, Cabin DAO is trying to create a decentralized community for creators. When I say decentralized, it means there's not going to be a mayor and a city council who run things, but it's going to be a physical community, maybe more than one. The first one they're building is in Colorado. And they have the members who are supporting this through the purchase of the tokens, and they're wondering about how to brand it. Now, when we talk about branding, we're talking about the logo for the DAO. If you go to VitaDAO, you'll see their branding. And on this post, and we'll have a link to it in the show notes, they talk about the branding of all of the DAOs they're aware of. There is a graphic of the DAO ecosystem that shows maybe 40 or 50 DAOs, and you can see all of their various logos. Who's coming up with them? Are they hiring a branding agency? Are they hiring a marketing agency? The proposition in this post is that it ought to be decentralized like the rest of the DAO. And they walk you through how some of the people who are leaders, because it's decentralized, but there are still people who take the lead on various things in a DAO, came up with the fundamentals and threw it out to the community, which is now riffing on it. And they've outlined what they hope will be the process that results in the branding approach they're going to take in presenting themselves to external communities, and how that needs to be flexible and adaptable as things change and evolve. And I thought it was a fascinating approach to dealing with this. You obviously don't have the benefit of experts who have studied branding and availed themselves of the research and know what works and doesn't work, but presumably there are people within the community who have some of that knowledge who can share their expertise. But ultimately, it's going to be a vote, just like anything else that happens in a DAO. And I wonder what the implications are of this to branding organizations and marketing organizations who traditionally have relied on organizations coming to them and say, help us with our branding, as opposed to the community saying, we're going to do it as a community.
Yeah. I mean, that was my first thought in this example we're discussing, that the expertise and skills in this area would come from people who are part of the DAO community. And that, in my view, this is not Web3 at all. This is natural, that you're going to tap people who have got the skills you want. Today, we're calling it a DAO. This is not brand new. What is new, I suspect, is just the formalized structure of this is new. But I can think of examples of people in volunteerism, for instance, who offer their skills to achieve a common goal in a community. So that's how you do it. So I could see this, and indeed the poster from Cabin that you're referencing, where they got examples of DAO branding, is actually really, really interesting. They reviewed 100 of the most popular DAOs. So I didn't know there would have been that many even, but less than 10% of them publicly feature any form of brand vision or style guide. There's no surprise, because this is only just getting off the ground. And I think if you're someone like me, for instance, who loves construction sites, is how I visualize stuff like this. This is terrific environment. If you want something already built, this is not for you. And the interesting thing too, or amongst the interesting, there's lots of interesting things, is how this is focused on being, this is the next generation of organization that's coming that we're heading towards. The implication of that, of course, is that the current generation of organization, and I hesitate to call them Web 1 or 2, let's not do that actually, are all the enterprises we know and love today, from the big global multinationals to the small enterprise, because they are centralized by the very nature of the legal entity of which they're made. This is not like that. This is the opposite. So this arguably then is not for companies today. But you mentioned when we were chatting earlier that there is a way that, let's call them centralized organizations, could embrace a decentralized organization, right? You had some examples of that, I think.
Well, I don't yet. I know there are some. I'm reading a book about it, and it's supposedly coming up in chapters that I haven't gotten to yet. But the point that they've made early is that a traditional corporation could own a private DAO in order to take advantage of the transaction layer and the tokenization and the votes to do something that has been more cumbersome and troublesome in its traditional mode. Also, I think I might take issue with the idea that this isn't Web3. Volunteer organizations, they bring people in to talk, but they still have a board of directors or an executive committee or a president who's going to say, no, that's not the logo that we want. Whereas here, it literally is a vote with tokens. So I would say that there is a Web3 component of the DAO that you don't get out of.
What you described is a Web3 component, i.e. the tokens. But
right.
the structure and how decisions are made isn't that different, because you've got to have some structure to make the actual decision. You absolutely can't rely on it just for a community to decide, so it won't happen.
Yeah, well, in the DAO, that's what it would be. It would be the vote. There'd be a recommendation maybe from the committee. If you look at a Discord group, you would see a channel that would say brand committee, and they would make a recommendation, and then everybody would vote. But code is law. Once the vote is done, that's the brand. Good. Nobody can say, nah, I'm in charge here.
No, that totally. I agree. Yeah, that is different. But I mean, the example of Cabin, though, is really quite interesting. I mean, they go through the background on traditional branding and how it applies to DAOs, and that's definitely worth reading to understand that differentiator. They talk about examples, and they quote some companies here that are DAOs and non-DAOs, as it were, the world's biggest brands, centralized and open source. How do they tackle branding? So you're looking at that element of it. Branding as a concept, how do you apply it to a decentralized organization? And they asked the question and provide the answer to why should DAOs care about branding? And then they've got a framework for decentralized branding. And then some examples. So they call them the 4 traits of decentralized branding, summarized quite nicely in this piece. It's definitely worth reading. And they give their own experience as well, the decentralized brand building at their own organization, their own decentralized organization. I think it's definitely worth reading. They also say, Shell, I mean, they talk about all of this is just the start of what they're getting into. And that's a key thing to, I think, take away from all of this, that what you and I are talking about, what we're citing as examples, what I hope our listeners are going to say, here, let me take a look at that. This is just the start of this. And there aren't yet many use cases that are credible. But I think Kevin's done a terrific job in assembling this explainer that's worth a read. And be sure, we're going to be talking about this again in the future, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I also love their school of fish analogy as to how this all works. So we'll have a link to that in the show notes, along with a couple of resources to help you understand DAOs, the Wikipedia article, Neville, that you mentioned. And that will be a 30 for this episode of For Immediate Release.